Wallenberg Centre are intimately aware of the dangers that foreign interference poses to Canadians. At this very moment, the founder and international chair of our centre, the Honourable Irwin Cotler, is under 24-hour security, a target of one of the most heinous forms of foreign interference.
That's a snippet of testimony at Canada's official inquiry into foreign interference in our election system. You heard Noah Liu, a lawyer and board member from the Raoul Wallenberg Centre for Human Rights, founded by none other than Irwin Cotler. The hearing was on October 24th. Many of you may not have known that for a year now, Cotler's been under around-the-clock police protection because of threats to his life due to his vocal advocacy for many political prisoners and also Iranian dissidents. Yet until now, all this time, Cotler asked us at the CJN not to talk about his being in a sort of house arrest for his own safety. And of course, we agreed not to. Then, a week ago, the story broke in the news about a much higher level of danger to his life. Only 2 days after that testimony on Parliament Hill on October 26th, the RCMP warned Cotler about imminent plans by Iranian assassins to murder him within the next 48 hours, just as Cotler was heading out in Montreal to attend the reunion of his McGill Law School class of 1964. Needless to say, Cotler didn't go, and he kept quiet about it again for a while. Then last week, the Globe and Mail published a story, and since the cat's out of the bag, so to speak, he's decided to end his silence and turn his ordeal into a call to action on a threat that he's actually been warning about for years, that Iran and other bad actors are carrying out interference with democracy around the world, not just in Israel and the Middle East now as the backers of Hamas and Hezbollah, but that they also have their tentacles here in Canada, the way Iran has already done elsewhere, and possibly are even behind the most recent kidnapping and murder of that young Chabad rabbi in the United Arab Emirates.
It's not just foreign interference during an electoral campaign. That's part of it. But our foreign interference inquiry was limited to that, and they didn't even name Iran as a country of concern. So we need a broader, more comprehensive and effective strategy.
I'm Ellen Besner, and this is what Jewish Canada sounds like for Monday, November the 25th, 2024. Welcome to the CJN Daily, a podcast of the Canadian Jewish News, made possible in part thanks to the generous support of the Ira Gluskin and Maxine Gronowski-Gluskin Charitable Foundation.
In Berlin, rumors are spreading.
Holocaust victims, their bodies are just dug up.
It's a shunda.
But the truth is even more unnerving.
Was your family in the Shoah?
Dude looks like he was in the Shoah.
As the world panics...
This is some ritual, bringing the dead back to life.
No, you said this wasn't illegal.
It isn't, I don't think.
One woman seeks the truth.
These are questions you can't answer.
And you're too afraid to even ask them.
Justice, a Holocaust zombie story. An original audio drama from the CJN in association with the Ashkenaz Foundation. Listen now at the cjn.ca/zombies or wherever you get your podcasts.
Professor Cotler's no stranger to the CJN Daily. We've interviewed him many times about being Canada's first special envoy to preserve Holocaust remembrance and combat anti-Semitism, about democracy protests in Israel. And he's been representing the Canadian families of the victims of the October 7th Hamas massacre and kidnapped hostages. And through his Raoul Wallenberg Centre, he's also turned a spotlight on the human rights abuses of political prisoners in a host of bad-acting countries, including Myanmar, Russia, China, and Iran. Now, though, we've discovered that Cotler's globe-trotting advocacy has come at a real cost to his life. But Cotler's continuing his mission and his usual hectic schedule of speaking engagements, lobbying politicians, and now calling for Canada to do more than just sanction Iran as a gross human rights violator with Magnitsky-style laws, which are already on our books, which prevent Iranian government officials from traveling here, from holding property or money here, and preventing Canadians from helping them out. Cotler joins me now from Montreal. You and I have talked about the security issues that you're facing for a while, but we didn't publicize it because you asked us not to.
It was not the first story. That's what's interesting about the media. After the initial reporting to me about the threat, which was at the beginning of November when my wife and I returned from Washington, when we arrived at the Montreal airport, we were told to await the RCMP who wanted to be in touch with us. And we were then advised that they had credible evidence of what they characterized as an imminent and lethal threat. And that from there on, I would be having 24/7 security protection, which I would like to add has been exemplary. I said nothing about that initial communication and threat, but then the Globe and Mail broke that story about it, and they called me, and I said no comment. I then learned thereafter that the threat was coming from the Iranian regime, which was not surprising to me because unknown maybe to most Canadians, but in the Iranian regime's media, I've been referenced on a number of occasions. And one occasion, they photoshopped an image of me with an Israeli flag as a kind of puppeteer standing behind Masih Alinejad and the women's movement standing behind the dissidents, etc. So this has been ongoing until the initial threat as it was conveyed to me last November, and then the more immediate one recently when I had to attend my 60th anniversary of my McGill law school class. And on that day, when I was about to go there, I was advised then by the authorities of what they characterized as an imminent lethal threat in the next 48 hours. And so I did not go. And then the story broke at the beginning of this week. The only thing I didn't know that he referenced in that report was that 2 of the suspects may have been apprehended. I still don't know if that is the case. I do know there's been somewhat of a downgrading in the level of my security protection. It's still present. It's still exemplary. But let's say we've gone from 5 armored cars to maybe 4, or downscaling of the number of people accompanying me. But when I go, as I will today, for my dialysis treatment, for example, they accompany me to the dialysis treatment as well as everything else.
Did you want this coming out?
Well, I think maybe it's better that it's out for one particular reason, because this is not about me. What we're talking about here is an intensifying policy and practice of transnational repression and assassination by the Iranian regime. I'm not the only one that has been targeted. My colleague Masih Alinejad, the very courageous Iranian women's rights dissident, she, of course, has also been targeted. Some American leaders have been targeted. But in the main, what we're witnessing are 2 things: an intensifying transnational repression and assassination. In Canada, we've had this foreign interference inquiry, but that's basically been addressing interference during elections and the electoral process. That's only one component, an important one, but only one of the larger phenomenon of transnational misinformation, disinformation, and cybersecurity warfare, number one. Number 2, the targeting of leaders of the Iranian diaspora, dissidents, journalists, human rights defenders. 3, the particular phenomenon of transnational assassination. And then the thing that we've been ignoring, and that's been the intensifying massive domestic repression. One of the targets of the domestic repression has been the Nobel Peace Laureate, Narj Mohammadi. She not only has been imprisoned and tortured in prison, but very recently denied the necessary medical treatment.
Canada's only declared the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps as terrorists this year, but in 2012, they sanctioned the Quds unit. But then they've also sanctioned certain members of the government. If the Canadians have been sort of gradually sanctioning more and more Iranian entities, let's use that word, it's not just a new thing. IRGC is just the latest. Why are they, it seems that they're just focusing on you more recently. So what changed? Why now are they ramping it up so much, do you think?
I think we've had a tipping point occurred with the October 7th. And indeed, if I may say parenthetically, one would have thought that such mass atrocities by this genocidal anti-Semitic terrorist organization, Hamas, that is basically is a proxy for the Iranian regime, one would have thought that this would have resulted in a mitigation of that anti-Semitism. in a global condemnation of it. On the contrary, what we've seen has been an unprecedented explosion of anti-Semitism globally and here in Canada. I have no problem with peaceful protests and pro-Palestinian protests. I've been a long-time supporter of two states for two peoples. This is not what this is all about. This is open support and justification, glorification of a listed terrorist entity backed by and incentivized by the Iranian regime. So we have reached a historical inflection moment because what we have here is an concerted, intensifying axis of evil involving Iran and China and Russia and also North Korea and the democracies which have not been mobilized together in unison to combat this threat. And now as Canada assumes the leadership of the G7 and will chair the next G7 meeting in Canada, now's the time to put the issue of Iranian regimes as a priority on the G7 agenda to get other G7 countries, not just US and Canada, to also list the IRGC on a terrorist list. And as I've also recommended, the Canadian government must establish an independent department in order to deal with the constituent elements of both transnational repression and domestic repression. I was very pleased that both houses of parliament condemned the Iranian regime's actions. And I think parliament now having shown the way, the government now must undertake the necessary initiatives, both organizationally and policy-wise, to combat this phenomenon.
Professor, we've been speaking about transnational aggression. And the morning of the day that we were speaking, the ICC, the International Criminal Courts, put out arrest warrants for Prime Minister Netanyahu in Israel and the former Defense Minister Yoav Gallant, and also the top Hamas leader Mohammed Deif, who's widely presumed to have been killed back in July by Israel. What's your reaction to these warrants? Is Iran behind them at all?
Yeah, no, I don't suspect Iran of having any influence here. I know the special prosecutor, Karim Khan, well. We made representation, when I say we, the Raoul Wallenberg Centre, and we made submissions to him last February in The Hague to bring the Hamas leadership to justice. And in fact, what we're talking now about warrants both about Hamas leaders as well as Israeli leadership. But the Israeli leadership, I felt that was ill-advised. Interestingly enough, both the Democratic and Republicans in the states, both administrations, have referred to the actions of the ICC, to use their words, as being outrageous. As somebody like myself has been a long-time supporter of the ICC, these arrest warrants are not simply prejudicial to the leadership of Israel. Israel, like any other state or any other democracy, has to be held accountable for any violations of human rights and humanitarian law. But the issue here is that the singling out of the Israeli leadership, when ICC is not supposed to substitute its judgment for that of an independent judiciary. So this is prejudicial to the ICC, not just to the Israeli leadership, to its own founding charter. And one of the paradoxes is that the special prosecutor, Karim Khan, went to Venezuela, met with Maduro, the head of that dictatorship, and decided not to issue arrest warrants against Maduro because he said Maduro was cooperating with the special prosecutor, let alone the fact that they don't have an independent judiciary. So that has been really an undermining of the ICC. And in fact, that I find very disappointing, to say the least.
How does that work now for the Israeli leaders? Are they still at risk of being caught by Interpol if they step one foot outside of Israel, even though Israel doesn't recognize that court?
We intervened in the hearings before the court at the time to say that the ICC did not have jurisdiction because Israel, as you said, was not a state party to the ICC. And now that this decision has been taken, the question is what countries will enforce it. As you know, there have been arrest warrants against Putin, and yet he was able to host a meeting of the BRICS, a number of countries associated with that. I would have thought that with regard to a democracy like Israel, that the international community of democracies would be protective of the Israeli leadership in order to be protective of the ICC and its mandate. So we'll have to see how this unfolds. I would hope that Israel make clear that they have been investigating any alleged crimes by any of the Israeli leadership, because at any given moment, those arrest warrants can be suspended. At any given moment, an end can be put to that investigation.
Are you advising the Israeli authorities now in this case, as you have good ties with them and have done before?
I have been in touch with them. I helped facilitate the proposed meeting between the Israeli leadership and the special prosecutor Irwin Cotler. I was in touch then with both Yoav Gallant, as he then was the Minister of Defense, and the Prime Minister Netanyahu. Was in touch with them, and I recommended then, under the framework of the ICC statute, that Israel should undertake its own independent investigations to necessarily thereby preclude any initiatives being taken by the ICC. They did begin some investigations. Then everything occurred as I mentioned. I think they should make it clear, the Israeli leadership at this point, that those investigations are ongoing and maybe establish an independent process for that purpose.
I want to just go back to the way you've had to live your life. You spend a lot of time in Israel because it's safer for you, has been safer for you there than living in Canada. What happens now in your personal life?
You mentioned an important point. It was suggested to me that things might have been safer in Israel because there's so many others that they want to go after there, and I'm not near the top of the list. In any case, at this point, for reasons of the medical issues that I mentioned, I'm undergoing the dialysis here, and for the foreseeable future, I'm here in Canada, and I'm hoping at this point, from my presence here now, to be able to assist in getting the Canadian government to establish an independent department to deal with transnational repression, to put this on the G7 agenda as a matter of priority, to mobilize the community of democracies in that regard. I hope my case is a wake-up call so that we hold the Iranian regime to account.
Professor Cotler, I just want to say on a personal basis that our community sends their best to you and all good wishes. And I also wanted to share one thing. I was in Hungary a couple of weeks ago for my first trip, and I went to the Raoul Wallenberg. There was a memorial plaque on the former British embassy. I was the only one in the tour group who had a good cry because I, being a Canadian, learned from your work and your efforts what he did and why he should be. And no one else, even the tour guide, didn't even know that he was famous outside of Budapest. And then I thought he was an ally for Jews during the Holocaust. Are you seeing at all more allies standing up despite the ICC now moving against the State of Israel leaders for war crimes?
Yes. So number one, Raoul Wallenberg is not only Canada's first honorary citizen, but he shows an example for what citizenship should be all about. In other words, he demonstrated how one person with the compassion to care and the courage to act can confront evil, prevail, and transform history. So I believe we have to go and get beyond our tribal divisions and our polarization of discourse and our extreme identity politics and come together now at this historic inflection moment. That should be, at this point, our call to action in Canada.
This call to action comes just days after the Canadian mission at the UN, Australia, them, a bunch of other countries voted to support the resolution condemning Israel and telling them to get out of they called it occupied territories. So this is new for Canada. You've been very close to the Canadian government, and now it's moving towards taking a harder line on Israel. So when you're seeing this threat against you and then you juxtapose it with what the Canadian foreign policy is doing, how does that sit with you?
Well, two things going on at the same time, but it's all related. And that is, how does the community of democracies operate? And with regard to the United Nations resolution, the Canadian position has been mistaken. in my view, both on matters of fact and on matters of law. For the community of democracies, including Canada, our position should have been to stand on the right side of history. Because regrettably, all that will do, that wasn't their intent, but the effect of it will be to incentivize Iran and its proxies when our position should be to hold them accountable. That position at the UN was wrong for Canada and for the other democracies.
And you've heard from a lot of people, I'm sure. House of Commons has been reaching out, supporting you, the Bloc, lots of public and private, probably, communications, I'm sure.
I just had a very, very moving conversation with former Prime Minister Paul Martin, and by the unanimous resolutions of the two houses. But I have to tell you, I've gotten untold numbers of support from the Iranian community, not only the Iranian-Canadian community, but the Iranian community writ large.
Have you heard from Justin Trudeau?
I've not heard directly from Justin Trudeau. No, I know he's been at the G20. I know some ministers have condemned it, but I haven't heard directly from him.
What about Polyev?
Yes, I have heard from Polyev.
Anything you want our listeners to know, any message you have for them after you've gone through this public ordeal this past week and a half?
No, Isaiah. I'm guided always by the sage Maimonides, who said we should each see the universe as divided into half evil and half good. Therefore, any good deed by any one of us on any given day transforms the ledger in a cosmic way from evil to good. So let's realize we can each perform a good deed every day, and that will be our undertaking on behalf of good as against evil.
We'll be talking again, and you'll be able to walk around and get ice cream at the Ashkenaz festival like the last time I saw you, with nobody around to guard you.
Yeah, that was a very pleasant moment, and I couldn't ask for a better combination. Being at the Ashkenaz festival, which I delighted going to, as you know, and ice cream being my favorite, not only dessert, but eating at any time. So look forward to being at the next festival, hopefully without any needed for security.
Now, our interview with Professor Cotler was recorded before the riots in Montreal, where anti-NATO protesters joined up with pro-Palestinian, anti-Israel protesters, with the resulting violence and broken glass and several arrests. And there were anti-Semitic slogans and anti-Semitic gestures all mixed in to a mess. But we did talk about what violence and protests are happening in Canadian streets and what Professor Cotler thinks about it.
Pro-Palestinian peaceful protest, yes, but we are seeing crimes being committed here on a regular basis in the public square and in the campus community. So this is a failure of leadership. The 4 Ps that governments are not undertaking. Number 1, prevention of such criminal behavior. 2, protection of the targets. 3, prosecution of the perpetrators. We're not doing that. And finally, partnerships. Federal, provincial, municipal, they're operating in silos. None of them are doing what has to be done. To say that this type of protest, which is a violation of so many articles in the criminal code, that is unacceptable. And that has to come from the top. And that has to be, we need moral clarity in our leadership, and we need the necessary action in furtherance of that moral clarity.
Really appreciate you taking the time.
Thanks, Alan.
And that's what Jewish Canada sounds like for this episode of the CJN Daily, sponsored in part by the Ira Gluskin and Maxine Granovsky-Gluskin Charitable Foundation. Later today in Montreal, Cotler is set to host an Israeli lawyer and human rights expert, Dr. Kochav El-Kayam Levy, an international law expert who headed the Civil Commission on October 7th crimes by Hamas against women and children. The pair are pushing the world to adopt a new definition of a particular kind of war crime that happened to entire Israeli families on October 7th. They're calling it kinocide, and they hope the term will become adopted by the UN and others, just like the word genocide was after 1948 and the atrocities of the Holocaust. Our show is produced by Zachary Judah Kaufman. Our executive producer is Michael Freeman, and the music is by Dov Beck-Levine. Thanks for listening.